The storm hit without warning. Snow slammed into the windshield of Claire Donovan's SUV like shards of glass, blinding her. Her knuckles turned white on the wheel as the icy road twisted under her tires. 1 second she was driving down the winding trail outside Aspen, Colorado. The next, her SUV skidded, flipped once, twice, and vanished under a wall of white. For a heartbeat, Claire hung in disbelief. The world had swallowed her whole. Panic clawed at her chest, but instinct kicked in. Survival didn't wait for fear. Miles down the trail, Jackson Miller, a single mother and former paramedic, had paused on her morning hike with her 7-year-old daughter Lily. The blizzard was relentless, each gust cutting like knives across her face. Then she saw it, a flash of movement, a twisted vehicle half buried in snow, smoke curling from its crushed hood. Her mind went cold for a second, memories of the fire that claimed her husband flickering like lightning. But she didn't hesitate. Lily was safe behind the thick scarf and parka she'd insisted her daughter wear. Jackson sprinted toward the wreck. Snow swallowed her boots, each step heavier than the last, but she ran because she knew what it meant to wait for help that never came. When she reached the SUV, the windows were shattered, doors mangled, and the male figure inside barely conscious. The CEO of a Fortune 500 tech empire, she'd later learn, was named Ethan Vaughn. In the polished world of boardrooms and billion-dollar deals, he was untouchable. Out here, he was fragile, shivering, and pale, his expensive coat soaked through, a thin line of blood tracing his temple. Jackson didn't pause. She lifted him carefully, feeling the unexpected weight of vulnerability in a man used to controlling the world. His lips quivered, but no words came. Her heart hammered. The storm showed no mercy, and she couldn't get him down the snowy trail alive. There was only one option. A cabin she remembered from a hike months ago, abandoned but still standing, tucked between frost-laden pines. Pushing through the cabin's creaking door, Jackson laid Ethan down on a bundle of quilts. The cold clung like a second skin, and the stove, old and reluctant, barely gave off heat. Yet inside the small room, life began to return. Ethan's eyes fluttered open, confusion and fear swimming in their icy blue depths. "Where?" he murmured, voice trembling. Jackson offered him water and checked his pulse, which thankfully was steady. He was disoriented, vulnerable, a man stripped of every layer of authority. She draped a thick blanket around his shoulders. The rough fabric smelled of dust and years forgotten, but he clutched it as if it were the last warmth in the world. For the first time, he looked at her not as a stranger, not as a rescuer, not as a woman who had saved his life, but as someone human, someone who had survived fear itself. A long silence stretched, broken only by the howl of the blizzard outside. Then, in a whisper barely audible over the wind, he asked, "Can I slip under the blanket?" Not desire. Not manipulation. Fear. Fragile need. Survival. Jackson hesitated. Memories of cold hospital sheets and her husband's last moments flashing before her eyes. But this was different. This wasn't about temptation. This was life, raw and unfiltered. She nodded, letting him lean against her. His shoulder trembled, his breath uneven, but warmth began to grow, first awkward, then necessary, then comforting. He smelled faintly of frost and fine cologne, but beneath it was something unguarded, human. For hours they stayed that way. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, a fragile bond began to form. Two people thawing from years of loss, loneliness, and survival. And just as Jackson thought the worst was over, a distant crack in the snow hinted that danger wasn't finished with them yet. The wind howled like a wild animal outside the cabin, rattling the old wooden walls. Jackson. Donovan pulled the blanket tighter around Ethan Vaughn, whose shivering had slowed but hadn't completely stopped. Her fingers were numb, her hair damp with snow, yet her mind raced. In the back of her head, she knew one thing. Survival wasn't just about heat, it was about keeping fear at bay. Ethan's gaze flickered around the dim room. This is insane, he muttered, voice hoarse. I should have stayed in Aspen. I should have never taken that road." Jackson didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied him, the CEO whose life had been measured in contracts and boardroom victories, now trembling under a threadbare blanket in a cabin he had never imagined. There was something raw in that, something Human, stripped of status, stripped of control. You're alive, she said finally, her voice low but firm. That's what matters right now. His lips quivered, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of vulnerability that no press release, no polished interview had ever shown. Ethan had always been untouchable, and here in a snowbound cabin in the Rockies he was simply a man, fragile, scared, and completely dependent on someone else. Jackson moved to the stove, coaxing the fire to life again. Sparks danced across the old metal as warmth slowly crept into the room. Ethan watched her, every movement meticulous, almost calculating, as if trying to absorb how someone else could simply survive. I've never been this helpless, he admitted, finally breaking the silence. His blue eyes, sharp and intelligent, now shimmered with fear. I always thought I could handle everything. But this is different. Jackson nodded. You're human, she replied. Even CEOs freeze in storms. The room fell silent for a moment, save for the soft crackle of the stove and the wind battering the cabin. Then Ethan shifted closer, careful, hesitating, as though unsure of boundaries. I don't usually let anyone see me like this, he murmured. I don't know how to. Jackson held up a hand. You don't have to. Not here. Not now. He exhaled, tension leaving his shoulders in a small sigh. Slowly he leaned against her, a gesture that was neither demanding nor intimate. It was survival, trust, and human warmth. Jackson felt the heat seep through the blanket, unspoken stories and vulnerabilities passing between them in quiet waves. Hours stretched, the storm outside a relentless curtain of white, but inside a fragile rhythm formed. Jackson learned, between flares of light and murmured breaths, that Ethan had carried burdens no one knew. His father had died suddenly, leaving the empire in his hands. At 27, every decision, every failure, every boardroom battle had slowly hollowed him out. And yet here he wasn't a CEO. He was simply a man, trying to breathe, trying to survive, trying to trust someone he barely knew. Jackson shifted slightly, keeping her warmth close to him. You need to stay awake. You can't drift off again, she said gently. I know, Ethan whispered. His eyes closed briefly, and for a split second Jackson thought he might slip into unconsciousness again. She placed her hand over his chest, feeling the steady thump of life beneath, a rhythm she clung to like a lifeline. Then, without warning, a sharp crack echoed outside. The snow-laden roof groaned. Ominously, Jackson's heart skipped. The cabin, old and forgotten, might not withstand another flurry. She looked at Ethan, alarm flashing in her eyes. We might need to move, she said. Ethan shook his head weakly. I can't. His voice was small, fragile. I trust you. I have to. And in that moment, Jackson realized trust wasn't given lightly, and it was now their most dangerous currency. One wrong move, one misstep, and both could be trapped, or worse. As night crept into the cabin, casting long shadows over their huddled figures, Jackson couldn't shake a single thought. This storm was far from over, and the secrets Ethan carried might be even more dangerous than the snow outside. And then a sudden howl outside made her freeze, a sound that wasn't the wind nor the cracking wood. Something, or someone was coming. The howl outside wasn't wind. Jackson's heart leapt as the sound tore through the cabin. Walls. Heavy footsteps crunched over snow piled against the roof. Ethan stirred, leaning closer to her, shivering more from fear than cold. Stay here, Jackson whispered. She slipped on her boots, grabbed the hatchet from her backpack, and crept to the door. Snow lashed her face, stinging, but she squinted through the frost-covered window. Nothing. Then a figure emerged, hunched, carrying something bulky. Jackson Escott screamed. Danger. Hiker? Thief. Worse. She knocked on the window softly. The figure froze, then bolted into the woods, swallowed by the storm. Her relief was short-lived. A hard knock rattled the cabin door. Jackson's heart skipped. Ethan gripped her hand. What do we do? He whispered. Jackson's mind raced. She couldn't leave him alone. I'll open slowly. No sudden moves. The hinges creaked as she cracked the door. A young man's face appeared, mostly hidden under a ski mask. His voice was muffled. "Help? I'm lost. My car flipped near the ridge." Jackson's instincts fought caution with survival. Frostbite was already creeping along his fingers. Slowly she opened the door, keeping the hatchet raised. "Inside," she said. Ethan's gaze followed nervously. For the first time he wasn't CEO, he was a man scared in a storm, fully human. The man collapsed inside, trembling violently. Jackson and Ethan wrapped him in blankets, coaxing warmth into his icy body. Hours passed as the storm battered the cabin, tension thick in every glance. Ethan finally spoke, voice raw. You just let him in?" Jackson shrugged. "He needed help. We all do." His eyes, sharp and calculating, softened with exhaustion. "In my world, helping strangers can ruin everything. Lawsuits, reputations. Out here, survival is the law," she said. "Not money. Not fear. Life comes first." Silence fell, broken only by the storm. Ethan's jaw tightened. Vulnerable in ways no boardroom had ever exposed. Jackson realized she'd never seen him truly human before. Then, without warning, the young man shivered violently, convulsing. Teeth chattering, lips blue. Jackson's paramedic instincts kicked in. "He's hypothermic. Move him to the stove." Ethan froze. Jackson grabbed his arm. "Help me, or he dies." He nodded, fear replaced by action. Together, they moved him closer to the stove. Jackson stripped wet layers carefully, monitoring for shock. Ethan followed instructions, hands trembling but steady. The storm had forced them into impossible teamwork, and they passed barely. Hours blurred. Jackson kept one hand on the man, the other on Ethan, exhaustion gnawing at her. Finally, the convulsions eased. Breathing steadied. Jackson sank onto a crate, shivering, sweat and snow mixing on her brow. Ethan watched quietly, admiration flickering in his icy blue eyes. I've never seen anyone like you," he admitted. "Strong, brave, unflinching, and yet you don't care what you might lose, only saving lives." Jackson smiled faintly, exhausted but unbroken. "Someone saved me once. Now it's my turn." A gust rattled the cabin, shaking the walls violently. Snow fell from the beams in small avalanches. Jackson's heart skipped. The storm wasn't done, and neither was the mountain's test. And in that frozen silence, she realized they weren't just surviving the blizzard. They were surviving each other, secrets, and truths buried under fear and pride. The night ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Night had settled over the Rockies, turning the cabin into a small, fragile haven amidst the raging blizzard. The wind pounded the walls, and the snow outside was a thick, unbroken white. Inside, Jackson Donovan and Ethan Vaughn huddled under the heavy blanket, the stove sputtering weakly, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Ethan stared into the flickering flames, eyes unreadable. I've never been this vulnerable," he murmured, voice barely audible. "Not in front of anyone." Jackson watched him, noting how a man who commanded billions of dollars now trembled. Not from cold, but from something far deeper. Fear of losing control. She adjusted the blanket around his shoulders, letting the warmth seep between them. "Vulnerability isn't weakness," she said softly. "It's proof you're human. That you care. That you survive." He swallowed hard, jaw tight. "I've built everything on control, precision, not letting anyone see who I really am. Not letting anyone see the cracks." His fingers fidgeted with the blanket edge. I don't even remember the last time I had a real day off. Not since my father died and I inherited the company. 8 years, no rest. No pause. Just endless expectations." Jackson listened, letting the words settle. She understood. Loss had shaped her too, raising her daughter alone after her husband's death, surviving hospital corridors and lonely nights. Life had a way of grinding people down, forcing them to armor themselves with perfection. But here, in this tiny cabin, survival demanded more than armor. "You're not alone," she said quietly. You have me here. We're alive together. That's what matters. Ethan exhaled, tension visibly draining. I've never accepted kindness without a price, he admitted. Every time someone offered help, I felt obligated, manipulated. But now, I don't know. I feel safe. And I don't know how to handle that. Jackson's gaze softened. Kindness isn't a transaction. It's a choice. Sometimes it's all we have. The storm rattled the cabin again, snow shaking from the roof. Ethan flinched, shivering slightly. Jackson shifted closer, instinctively wrapping her arm around him. You need to rest. You can't keep fighting yourself in the cold. His voice faltered. I've never let anyone care like this before. And it terrifies me. Jackson smiled faintly, exhaustion and relief mixing. Good. Then trust me. For a long moment, they simply sat there, the storm outside a deafening roar, the stove sputtering, shadows stretching across the walls. Every flicker of flame, every small movement carried meaning, warmth, trust, fragile human connection. Ethan rested his head briefly against her shoulder, a silent gesture of surrender. Not romance, not obligation, just survival and trust. Jackson closed her eyes for a second, feeling the life and warmth steady against her chest. You're more than your title, Ethan. You're more than your company. Out here, you're just a man, and that's enough. He whispered, almost to himself. I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that to me before. A loud crack echoed from outside. The storm hadn't relented. Snow shifted heavily on the roof, threatening to collapse under the weight. Jackson's eyes snapped open, adrenaline surging. She realized that despite the emotional thaw, the physical danger was far from over. We need to keep alert, she said, voice low but firm. Nothing about tonight is over. Ethan nodded, finally meeting her gaze fully. There was fear there, yes, but also something new. Recognition that survival and trust required both courage and humility. And in that moment, Jackson knew that what had started as a rescue was evolving into something neither of them could have predicted. And just as the storm's howl seemed to reach a crescendo, a faint light glimmered through the snow outside, a signal that someone somewhere was searching. But would they arrive in time, or was the mountain about to test them one final time? The night had deepened, the cabin almost swallowed by the unrelenting blizzard. Snow piled high against the windows, dimming the flickering stove light. Jackson Donovan's breath formed clouds in the freezing air as she moved between Ethan Vaughn and the young man they had rescued earlier, checking on each of them. The storm outside wasn't just a test of endurance, it was an assault, a relentless reminder that survival demanded constant vigilance. Ethan, still pale but steadier than hours before, watched her movements with something between awe and unease. You never stop, he said quietly. I've spent my life commanding people, yet you move through chaos like it's second nature. Jackson gave a faint, tired smile. Chaos doesn't wait for titles, Ethan. Neither does survival. A sudden crack made them all jump. Snow shifted heavily on the cabin roof, a loud groan echoing through the walls. Jackson's instinct screamed danger. The old cabin, already weather-beaten, could give way under the blizzard's weight. She grabbed a rope from her backpack, securing loose beams and reinforcing the structure as best she could. Ethan moved closer to help, hesitant at first, then surprisingly capable, following her lead without hesitation. The night stretched on, punctuated by bursts of wind and the howl of the mountains. Silence was a rarity. Even the quiet moments held the weight of tension. Jackson could see Ethan watching her, trying to reconcile the CEO he knew with the man under the blanket. Human, vulnerable, and utterly reliant on someone else. You saved me, he murmured, voice low. And I've never had anyone care like this. No one. Not ever. Jackson didn't respond immediately. She understood better than anyone that gratitude didn't erase fear or danger. But her heart softened. We're alive because we trust each other, she said. That's all it takes sometimes. Hours blurred. The fire sputtered, the wind rattled the cabin, and snow fell like a living thing, pressing against every wall. Ethan finally let himself lean fully against her, eyes closing. Briefly, exhaustion overtaking fear, Jackson felt the weight, not just of his body, but of the walls he'd been forced to tear down in the storm. She adjusted the blanket, holding him steady. Trust, she realized, was stronger than any steel door or business contract. Then a faint tapping at the window. Jackson's heart skipped. The snowstorm made visibility near zero, yet something moved, something deliberate. She signaled Ethan to stay down, hatchet ready, and crept closer. A figure appeared, partially obscured by flurries, waving frantically. A rescue team, finally fighting its way through the storm. Relief surged, but danger wasn't gone. The cabin had taken a beating, and the mountain seemed unwilling to release them without one final test. Jackson motioned for Ethan to follow. He rose, wobbly but determined, and together they helped the young man outside. The blizzard lashed at their faces, snow clinging to hair and clothing, yet for the first time in hours, movement toward survival felt possible. As the rescue team neared, Ethan paused, glancing at Jackson. "I don't even know how to thank you," he said, voice catching. "You didn't just save me. You changed something inside me." Jackson's lips curved faintly. "You'll figure it out. Survival isn't about thanks. It's about being human when the world isn't." The storm raged, yet through the chaos, a fragile victory emerged. They had survived, but both knew that the blizzard was only a physical trial. The emotional journey, the vulnerability, the trust, the confessions, was far from over. And as they trudged through the snow toward safety, Jackson couldn't shake the thought. Some storms leave more than ice and snow. They leave truths that can't be ignored. The snow was blinding, a living wall of white that tore across the mountainside. Jackson Donovan's boots sank deep with every step, Lily clinging tightly to her arm, Ethan stumbling beside them, pale but moving. The cabin was behind them now, a fragile memory of survival, battered by wind and snow, yet still standing. "Keep moving," Jackson shouted over the roar of the blizzard, adrenaline spiking. Her lungs burned, but fear gave her wings. Every second mattered. One slip, one hidden patch of ice, and the mountain could claim them still. Ethan's voice cracked, voice raw with exhaustion and awe. I can't believe we made it out thanks to you." Jackson glanced at him, letting the wind whip snow into her face. "You did your part too. Don't underestimate yourself. We survived together, or not at all." A shadow loomed ahead, flashing lights slicing through the white. Rescue. The signal team had broken through the storm's fury. Jackson's pulse jumped. Relief surged, but instinct sharpened her senses. She knew better than to trust the blizzard's mercy just yet. The team approached, shouting, their voices muffled by wind. Jackson guided Ethan forward, keeping a steady hand on him as he stumbled, each step a test of trust and endurance. Lily clung to her, silent but wide-eyed, the storm reflected in her innocent gaze. When they reached the first rescue sled, Jackson helped Ethan climb aboard. His hands shook, his teeth still chattering, but the vulnerability, the raw humanity, was gone. Looked different now, stripped of the CEO armor, exposed in fear and gratitude, yet undeniably alive. Jackson followed with Lily, the rescued young man close behind. Every step forward felt surreal, the storm's grip fading, replaced by the muted roar of adrenaline and relief. But even as they approached safety, the mountain had left its mark. Their bodies were battered, but their hearts, heavier, changed raw with experience. Ethan finally broke the silence, voice soft, almost trembling. "Jackson, I don't think I've ever felt this alive. Not in years. Not ever." She kept her eyes forward, guiding the sled carefully. Being alive isn't just about surviving storms, Ethan. It's about being human while you survive. About trusting. About letting someone in when the world tells you not to. He nodded slowly, understanding settling in. For the first time, he wasn't a CEO measuring lives in profit and loss. He was simply a man who had faced mortality, fear, and kindness all at once, and it had reshaped him. The rescue team finally cleared the slope. Warm lights of the base camp glowed like beacons in the snow. Jackson helped Ethan down, steadying him as Lily ran to a medic waiting with blankets. The young man they'd saved earlier was led to safety as well finally. Out of immediate danger. Ethan took a deep breath, the mountain air still biting, but calmer now. I don't know how to thank you. Not for saving me, but for showing me something I'd forgotten existed. Trust. Humanity. Jackson smiled, exhaustion finally settling into her bones. You don't need to thank me. You just need to remember it. Carry it forward. That's all that matters. For a moment, they simply stood in the snow, the blizzard a distant roar behind them, hearts pounding, life renewed in a way no boardroom or city street could ever replicate. And yet, even as they looked back at the fading storm, Jackson knew this was only the beginning. The mountain had stripped them bare, revealed truths they couldn't ignore, and forged a fragile bond between two people from entirely different worlds. The storm was over, but what had begun in the white fury of survival would echo far beyond the mountains, shaping everything that came next. The sun barely pierced the mountain haze, snowflakes still drifting like shards of shattered glass. Jackson Donovan's boots crunched against the packed snow as she led Ethan Vaughn toward the waiting helicopter, the rescue team's chatter muffled by the wind. Each gust tore at their faces, whipping hair into frozen tangles, but neither stopped. Every step felt like a heartbeat of survival. Ethan stumbled once and she caught him. Careful, she hissed, voice sharp, urgent. Almost there. I don't even know who I am anymore, he admitted, chest heaving, blue eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. Everything I built, I thought it mattered. But out here it doesn't. Jackson's gaze softened. It only matters if you remember what it's built for. Life. People. Not numbers or power. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time she saw it. The walls were gone. No CEO mask. No elegance. Just a man who had stared death in the face and survived. The helicopter blades thrashed the snow around them as they approached. Jackson helped Ethan up the metal ladder, her hands steady despite exhaustion. The storm had stripped them raw, yet here in the roar of survival, everything felt profoundly alive. Inside the helicopter, the warmth hit them like sunlight. Ethan sank into a seat, shivering but smiling faintly, a glimmer of relief breaking through the fear still lingering in his bones. Jackson secured Lily and the young man they'd saved earlier. The rotors lifted them above the mountains, revealing the storm's full scope, white peaks stretching endlessly, the world beneath frozen and merciless. Ethan pressed his hands together, staring through the window. We really survived, he whispered, voice trembling. All of it. Jackson leaned back, exhausted, letting the hum of the helicopter wash over her. You survived because you let go. You trusted. And sometimes that's all it takes to live. Ethan's eyes met hers, and something unspoken passed between them, a truth forged in fear, fire, and ice. He reached out, hesitated, then brushed her hand lightly. Not romance. Not obligation. A human connection. Raw and undeniable. Hours later, they reached the base camp. Medics swarmed, checking vitals, wrapping them in blankets, but Jackson and Ethan only watched each other for a moment longer. Words weren't enough. They had seen each other stripped to the bone, confronted mortality together, and had survived not just the storm, but the truths inside themselves. Ethan broke the silence. Jackson, I don't think I've ever felt safe without conditions before. Not in my life. But with you. I felt it. She shook her head, faint smile curving her lips. Safety isn't a transaction. It's a choice. And tonight, you chose to live differently. You chose trust. He swallowed, emotion heavy in his throat. I want to meet Rowan, he said quietly, referencing her daughter. I don't know why, but I feel like I need to. Jackson's heart tightened. He's amazing. You'll see. But know this. Nothing about this Night will leave either of us unchanged. Outside, the storm had passed entirely. Snow gleamed like crystal under the pale morning sun. The mountains, once a brutal prison, now seemed serene, almost forgiving. Yet both knew the scars of survival, the bond forged in ice and fear, would remain forever. Ethan looked at Jackson, then to the horizon. I don't know what comes next, but I know I don't want this connection to end. She smiled, a small, weary, perfect smile. Then it won't. Not if we remember it. As they walked toward the warmth of the camp, Jackson glanced back at the mountains, the cabin they had survived, the storm that had tested everything they were. For a moment she allowed herself to feel something rare. Hope. The helicopter blades cut the cold air, the snow settling in quiet drifts. Two broken humans had walked through fire and ice, faced death, and emerged not as strangers, but as witnesses to each other's courage, trust, and humanity. And sometimes Vivek realized surviving the storm is only the beginning. The real test is living after it, with truth, with vulnerability, and with hearts wide open. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because kindness deserves to be heard.